Hello and welcome to today's LaRouche Organization Manhattan Project discussion for Saturday, April 29th. Today we're talking about the Xi-Zelensky phone call, countering transatlantic delusion with a real peace initiative. Now, this past Wednesday, a phone discussion happened between China's Xi Jinping and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky for the first time since the Russian special military operation Upshift in the now 9-year-old Ukrainian conflict. Now, the question is, has that discussion opened the exit door, potentially moving the world away from a potential thermonuclear Armageddon?
Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke by telephone on Wednesday with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. Zelensky, in a tweet, described a, quote, long and meaningful call with Xi. In Beijing, a government official said China would send special representatives to Ukraine to hold talks with all parties in an effort to end the crisis. China has repeatedly tried to present itself as a potential intermediary between Moscow and Kyiv. But Ukraine's Western allies have viewed Beijing's diplomatic overtures with heavy skepticism. Xi is the most powerful world leader to have refrained from denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He made a state visit to Russia last month, a sign of support for Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin. Since February, Xi has promoted a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, one greeted with caution by Kyiv. But Zelensky has been careful not to appear to reject Chinese offers outright. Ukrainian officials have long been calling on Beijing to use its influence in Russia to help end the war. China says it is positioned to help mediate the conflict because it has not taken sides publicly. U.S. National Security Council spokesperson Jack Kirby last month said that if Beijing wanted it to be taken seriously, it needed to call for Russia to pull back from Ukrainian territory.
We encouraged President Xi to advocate for this exact essential key point, which must include the withdrawal of Russian forces from sovereign Ukrainian territory consistent with the UN Charter.
The White House on Wednesday welcomed the talks between Zelensky and Xi, but Kirby said it was too soon to tell whether it would lead to a peace deal. Western countries warn China's 12-point peace proposal for Ukraine is too vague, offers no concrete path out of the war, and could be used by Putin to promote a truce that would leave his forces in control of occupied territory.
The problem that persists is the brainwashing of populations in the transatlantic sector through various media that keep claiming that NATO's war with Russia is winnable because, quote, it won't go nuclear. Here's what Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the Schiller Institute founder and leader, had to say about the international situation this week.
Well, I think that the Western establishments seem to believe their own narrative. But narratives are unfortunately not the reality. The reality is that, you have right now an unbelievable process going on. You have the definite crisis in the West with all the symptoms you just described. You have the absolute determination of the countries of the global South to no longer be, the colonial slaves of that unipolar world, and they are definitely moving in the direction of establishing a multipolar system, which is not the end of the wisdom in my view. But, so there is this tendency, and, what is happening, I think most worrisome, is that this determination to keep the unipolar world, send more weapons to Ukraine, is leading increasingly to a situation where the war danger is actually, in my view, increasing by the day. And, step by step, we are moving closer to a possible catastrophe. For example, Vladimir Yermakov, who is the head of the arms control and the non-proliferation and arms control department of Russia, he just put out a warning saying that, not only is the New START treaty in danger, but with that, the entire fate of humanity, and that all the calls coming from Russia to the West to notify this increasing danger are finding deaf ears. And I think, on the other side, you have such things like a clear effort to unite the EU with NATO in a global NATO. I mean, this Borrell, Joseph Borrell, the so-called foreign minister of the EU, he is calling for increasingly European navies to patrol the strait between mainland China and Taiwan, which has been absolutely rebuked sharply by China, obviously, because, this is what does the EU have to do with Taiwan? So, I think we are really moving very much in a more and more dangerous direction. And I think the demand, the same Borrell, by the way, there was just a European Foreign Council meeting in Brussels, where Borrell basically said that they have now decided on a plan of action, which is designed to put maximum pressure on the countries of Africa, of Latin America, of Asia, to take sides and join with the so-called democracy to counter the narrative of Russia, to basically, not go with economic ties with China. And that in a situation, where it is very clear that, for example, on the question of the narrative around Ukraine, what led to this catastrophe, all the African nations did not vote with the West on the explanation of the narrative. And that is because they have their own experience, with these same colonial powers. And so, it's a futile effort to try, to win over the developing countries. I mean, the way to win over the developing countries would be very simple. If the EU would have done, in terms of economic investments in Africa, what China has been doing in the last 10 years, there would be no problem because, then the Africans would not turn against the West. But the saying in Africa right now is that if you deal with China, you get an airport or you get a railway. If you're listening to the Americans or the Europeans, you get a sermon and no economic aid. So, I think the West is really not realistically looking at the situation, and the effort to continuously pursue a unipolar world, even go for the destruction of the Russian Federation, which, there is a whole series of conferences today, this week in Washington by the so-called post-Russia forum. And that, in a certain sense, spells disaster. So I think the West is clearly, run by an apparatus which is heading towards a catastrophe. And, just to mention that as a major factor, the situation in Germany is absolutely catastrophic. In Germany, the economic bottom is falling out. We see the mass bankruptcy of medium-sized and medium and small industries, Mittelstand. We see an absolute escalation in, basically the ending of any sign of relation between Germany and Russia. That has been totally ruined. And, I think that we are heading towards a perfect storm in Germany alone because, what people are expressing in the streets is that, how did we get here? How comes that we have a foreign policy and an economic policy which leads to the absolute ruin of Germany? How did we get there? And I think this will not go on for long. So, I think we are in an unbelievable situation where, it would be so easy to solve it, but it would require that the West is taking an attitude of cooperation with the global South instead of trying to continuously impose an unipolar world, which in reality has long gone. So I think it's a very dangerous moment. And, I have expressed it in other occasions. I think if people would be aware how close we are to the possible annihilation of civilization, because if it comes to a nuclear confrontation between the major nuclear powers, then that's the end of civilization. So I think, people are not really in reality who don't see it that way.
Narratives, no matter how often government or people repeat them, are never true. Censorship and government lies protected by censorship are not new, But today there is an industry devoted to hiding the truth, to convincing the people that war against Russia and China is good. Anyone contesting that war must be a Putin puppet or conspiracy theorist. But some individuals are exposing the largely hidden interconnection between intelligence agencies, government, corrupt political parties, and the media. In New York City this past week, the fight for truth was taken directly to the cover-up artists of the media themselves at a conference held at Columbia University.
Oh, is this the lecture hall with Seymour Hersh? I'm looking for the one with Seymour Hersh because it's a policy and press hall event. So shouldn't we be talking about the Nord Stream since that's the biggest story of the century? And you guys, I'm sorry. I mean, you have the executive editor of the New York Times there who came out with a phony story to try and block Seymour Hersh. It's just kind of funny how that happened, I mean, did you even acknowledge Seymour Hersh? All of you are executive editors of papers that broke Pentagon, My Lai, Watergate. Is this the same papers or not? I mean, is there anything you've gotten right in the last 20 years, or am I mistaken about that? I mean, it's just kind of funny because Iraq, wrong. Syria, wrong. Russiagate, really wrong. Okay, I mean, the list goes on and on. So the last thing you could do to try and actually fix your reputation is acknowledge that through leaks, we had to find out that Zelensky was going to bomb Moscow on the anniversary. I mean, if you're so impartial, shouldn't you at least say, right, that Zelensky was going to bring us on the verge of World War III? That seems pretty fair. While Julian Assange rots in prison, all of you've got, fat checks because he's in jail for doing your job. And you know what? Tucker Carlson ain't no Seymour Hersh, but he did something you guys are scared to do. Speak the truth and actually be critical of the war, which is why he was actually fired from Fox, because you are all cowards. Every single one of you. None of you have actually had any relevancy. And you know what? The mainstream press is now dying. Nobody's ever going to listen to you again. You have no credibility with the public. The only people who care about what you have to say are elite assholes who have nothing productive to say anymore. And it's dying off. So will you at least say something, either about Nord Stream or Ukraine or the fact that Zelensky brought us to the verge of World War III and the only reason we knew about that was through leaks? Go ahead. It's a free speech event, right? You guys are the press. Let's say something here. Mr. Khan, come on. You're the executive editor of the New York Times, I'm just trying to get into some good trouble here, man. Woo. Listen, Karen, get out of my face for a second. I got to talk to these gentlemen. Okay. Well, I just want to hear what they have to say. Go ahead. I'm done.
Wait your turn.
You're not going to you. Come.
Wait your turn.
You could project if we can't.
I would just say I think it's important to hear everybody's point of view.
Yeah.
So thank you.
All right.
I do think that we need to give our moderator a chance to ask other questions.
We're on the verge of World War III.
Some of the people in the audience also do so. Thank you. Really, thank you.
Say something about this bombing. We blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Listen, don't stand there while there are people rotting in prison. Nobody said anything about Uhuru, right? The socialists who are in jail for being critical of this war. God damn it.
Let's go.
At least say something about the people in jail for being critical of this war. They don't deserve to be in prison right now.
Now, to discuss the mass media myth management complex, we have two guests today, Harley Schlanger and Mike Robinson of UK Column. So, Harley, you have the floor.
Well, it's always hard to follow Jose, especially when he's being dragged out the door. But let me take up this question of what I'm calling the disinformation industrial complex, which is what we're dealing with, this question of why people are not openly discussing the war, why they're not out in the streets, why the fraud and corruption is not being exposed, except by individuals taking action like Jose did with that kind of intervention. Now, let me begin by saying that the potential for peace is real right now. The move to a new paradigm, a new security architecture and development architecture. There are initiatives to end the war from President Xi of China, President Lula of Brazil, the Pope offering the Vatican as a neutral venue for talks, Orban of Hungary, Erdogan, even Macron talking about negotiations. And the reality is that Ukraine's military has been largely depleted by the war so far. They're running out of weapons. The West is running out of weapons. And there's opposition from the global majority to continuing this war. But the war continues. Arms are said to be flowing in. The other day they announced that 98% of the promised arms have arrived. Well, since there's no accountability, there's no inspector general to let us know if that's true. We don't know if it's true. But the promises for more arms continue. NATO, led by the British and echoed by the war hawks in the US Congress, are saying there must be no negotiations, only a Ukrainian victory. Zelensky continues to insist, echoing NATO, that there'll be no negotiations. This is backed by President Biden, by NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg, and others. So what we're looking at is a level of delusion. Let me give you two of the most egregious examples. The Economist magazine on April 26th had an article basically with a proposal that could lead immediately to World War III and nuclear war. They said the demand for F-16 fighter jets by Ukraine is a just one, a right one, and they're needed. Otherwise, Russia will establish full dominance in the air. And the Russians say they already have. The Economist goes on to say that if the Russians consolidate that kind of dominance, then it would eliminate the possibility of Ukraine reclaiming territory. So therefore, the F-16s must be delivered. Don't worry, Putin is bluffing about using nuclear weapons, at least according to the editors of The Economist. Now, then you have the Ukraine Victory Bill that was introduced in Congress, with support from both Republicans and Democrats, the Uniparty. And it calls for a Ukrainian military victory over Russia. It says Ukraine must be brought into NATO. And it said Russia must be held accountable for war crimes. Now, I find this particularly rich coming from a Congress which has never said anything about the war crimes committed by American presidents and backed by, in some cases, congressional declarations, where we have pillaged the world, we've killed leaders, we've conducted genocidal warfare and sanctions. Those are not war crimes. But what we're looking at is a consensus in the establishment in the West to continue the war regardless of the consequences for the people of Ukraine. No negotiation until the Russians are out. That's what Ukraine's Committee to Combat Disinformation is saying. That China, listen to what the Chinese are saying, but their plan on ceasefire and negotiations is inappropriate. And they criticize the proposal to end sanctions. So the war party is fully engaged and fully committed. Now, what does rejection of negotiations mean? It means more war, more deaths, more destruction. The costs borne by countries of financial aid and weapons for this war. For example, the U.S. has already delivered maybe $60 billion out of the $113 billion promised. But at the same time, they're terminating up to 15 million recipients of Medicaid. There's a cost to this. You can't simply spend money on warfare without a cut somewhere else. The French are raising the retirement age to be able to pay for the war. Germany, as Helge was saying, is advancing into a state of deindustrialization, where German businesses are not able to stay open, and bigger industries are looking for other countries to move to. So why are there not more and larger protests? Why do people tolerate a situation where incompetent and corrupt leaders are taking us into conditions that could lead to a nuclear war? Now, some of this has to do with the destruction of education and culture. And we should probably take this up at another Manhattan Project event, because the destruction of education in the West is quite profound. The cultural levels of the population have degenerated incredibly, and people's interest in other cultures is largely limited to entertainment and tourism. So the idea that somehow we would understand what's going on in another country is not important. You don't need to know the history. You don't need to know the culture. And that's how the unipolar order works. It seduces people in the West into believing that the rest of the world is there for us to loot and for us to play in. But they don't have legitimate interests that should be recognized. But the bigger problem with the lack of reaction is the media role in propaganda and brainwashing. And that's what I call the disinformation industrial complex. There's a media cartel. In the US, there are 6 companies that control most of the media. And this is an integral part of the promotion of the unipolar order idea. The media are, on the whole, totally behind the policies of the corporate cartels, of the military-industrial complex, of the financial and banking and insurance cartels, of big pharma, of the raw material companies, and so on. And for the globalist corporate cartels, the idea is to carry out wars, if necessary, to force nations to submit passively to what's called the rules-based order. Now, in the video you saw of Jose Vega confronting editors of the New York Times, the Washington Post, Reuters, and someone else, these were the cartel leaders, and they had nothing to say. Now, here's a profound irony about that. The event, I believe, was held at the Columbia School of Journalism, or was sponsored by the Columbia School of Journalism. The Columbia Journalism Review had an article in its January issue by Jeff Gerth, who spent 3 decades at the New York Times. The article is titled "The Press and the President." And what he showed, or the press versus the president, a 2,400-word article dissecting the Russiagate story, showing that what was covered in especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as CNN and others, but particularly the Times and the Post, what Gerth showed is that it was false, fabricated, it had a political intent, and that it was a coordination between intelligence, military, U.S. government, including the FBI and the CIA, political figures, in this case the Clinton campaign, and the media. And there was an integration between the 3 of them in promoting this mythology that Putin intervened on behalf of Trump, that Trump was the beneficiary, he was elected because of Putin's intervention, and all the so-called evidence to prove that has turned out to be false and discredited, even by some of the media that kept printing it. So it was a devastating expose of Russiagate. And what's the response to it? No accountability. The same people who said that Putin intervened to elect Trump are still writing stories. They're writing stories now about the great victory of Ukraine, the corruption in Russia, and so on. Now, what we're seeing is similar to what was done with Julian Assange. He told the truth. He published the truth using U.S. military documents to show the crimes committed by the U.S. in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And what was the result? Were the war criminals brought to account? No, but Julian Assange is in a prison where he's been for 4 years, waiting extradition, where he'll probably end up, if he is extradited, spending the rest of his life in solitary confinement in a prison in the United States. Where is the accountability for the criminal actions by the U.S. government? Same thing with Snowden, who exposed the NSA metadata collection and spying. And if he were to come back to this country, he would probably be put in a solitary confinement prison. So I want to present briefly four case studies which show the extent to which this disinformation industrial complex is determining the mood in the population, the lack of knowledge in some cases, the confusion, and more importantly, the pessimism and depression around the idea that you can't really know, and if you do know, you can't do anything about it. Now, the first one is an obvious one, which Jose brought up in his intervention, the Seymour Hersh story about Biden's commitment and responsibility for sabotaging the Nord Stream pipeline. Seymour Hersh put this story out in, when was it? February 8th. There was deadly silence from most of the media. Eventually, some people started writing stories where they would say something like, well, Hersh only had one source. Well, here's the point. That explosion was in September 2022. Hersh's explanation came out on February 8th, 2023, and yet no one in the media was engaged in an investigation of this. No one was holding the US government accountable. No one asked them, did you do this? And when John Kirby was asked and said, no, of course not, there was no follow-up. And then, from the sublime to the ridiculous, you had the New York Times and Die Zeit of Germany come out with articles which claimed that an unknown group of 6 private citizens, may have been Ukrainian, rented a yacht and conducted the sabotage. Now, the only question about that story is, why would they do something that was so flimsy a story that was easy to counter if they're really trying to undermine the credibility of Seymour Hersh? Now, I would say Hersh's credibility has not been undermined, and the story still stands. The other question then is, why has the German parliament not done an investigation into the destruction of infrastructure essential for economic policy and development in Europe and especially in Germany? Well, it's the media has played a big role in creating confusion. In fact, the New York Times, in a recent article, asked the question, maybe the best thing is not to know. It may be in no one's interest to reveal more, is what the Times said, as to why there's not more investigations going on. So that's the Seymour Hersh story on the Nord Stream pipelines. The second one is the most recent story of the Pentagon leaks. The 21-year-old National Guardsman who downloaded what appear to be top security clearance documents onto a website, into a gaming website, Discord, that went unnoticed by the military and others for several months, but contained top secret, highly classified documents that revealed such things as that Western special forces are now deployed inside Ukraine. 50 from the British, about 15 from the United States. They had the documentation of the discussion going on in the higher ranks of the US military, casting doubt on whether or not there could be an effective spring offensive by Ukraine. So we've been hearing over and over, the spring offensive will change everything. Our weapons are going in there, the Ukrainians are prepared, the spring offensive will be a big blow to Russia. And yet, while they're saying that, behind the scenes, they're saying, we don't know if Ukraine can do it, we don't know if there's enough weaponry, if they have enough personnel, and on and on and on. The shortage of missiles, the degradation of the air defense of Ukraine, all of these things were laid out in these documents, which were top secret, which suddenly came out into the open. But did they? What was the media response to this? The frenzy was not about who's telling the lies, who's doing the cover-up, what are they covering up? No, the media frenzy was, who leaked this? How can we get him? And it turned out that supposedly Bellingcat, which Mike Robinson can tell us more about if we want to know, which is essentially an operation of British intelligence, and the New York Times tracked down the 21-year-old National Guardsman that they claim released these documents and took credit for it, to much acclaim from the rest of the media. The media did its job. No, it didn't. It never held accountable those who were lying about a war in which hundreds of people, thousands of people are dying on both sides, and a war which, had the media done its job, would never have happened, because the media could have reported that the US and NATO were continuing to move eastward despite promises given to Russia. And there's much more that could be said about how this was provoked by NATO, but none of that was covered. Just as the real story of what these documents revealed was left to the last paragraph in some of these articles in the media, if it was covered at all. Now, then we have the third case, the case of the Twitter files. And these were released in early December 2022, released actually in October 2022 to a team headed by Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, and Li Fang, among others. And they started producing stories on them in December. Now, the subject was the role that Twitter was involved in so-called content moderation. That is, deciding what stories were legitimate that could be sent out via Twitter and which should be suppressed or blocked completely. Now, the suppression is done by something called visibility filtering, which is known to many people as shadow banning, where they reduce the visibility of tweets that go against the accepted narrative. But the more egregious case was that of the Hunter Biden laptop. And what the Twitter files showed is the degree to which U.S. intelligence figures, including the FBI, U.S. congressmen in both parties, were involved in using Twitter for censorship. But in the Biden laptop case, the New York Post story was shut down completely. And this was something that was in the middle, right before the election, so that there could be no discussion of what was in the laptop and what the story was. Now, so it remained 2 years later for this story to come out. Now, what the Twitter files show is that in the Hunter Biden case and in other cases of content moderation, censorship, blocking, and so on, that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, were warning of foreign interference in the 2020 election. And that's why these measures had to be taken. Now, that brings us to the fourth case. The testimony that was revealed from during congressional hearings about Mike Morell, the former acting director of the CIA, who in a private hearing under oath admitted that he had been approached by Tony Blinken, probably around October 17th, just when the Hunter Biden laptop story was coming out. Blinken, who is a top advisor to Biden's campaign, contacted Morell, and according to Morell's testimony, triggered in him the sense that he had to do something about this, to expose this as a fraud. And so on October 19th, Morell wrote a letter, the famous letter signed by 50 other top U.S. intelligence officials. Again, this shows the extent to which the intelligence community was organizing with the media to conduct interference in the election. Now, what Morell said, remember what the letter said, is that the story of the Hunter Biden laptop has, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation, unquote. It admitted in the article, or in the letter, that they had no solid evidence of this, but it was their judgment, the assessment of these 50 top intelligence people, that this was another example of Russian interference in the U.S. election. And therefore, it was legitimate that the New York Post story was squelched and nothing else came out about the Hunter Biden laptop before the election. Now, Morell admitted that afterwards in his testimony that he did this because he had concern that, quote, the Russians were playing on this issue, unquote, just as he and all the others did on Russiagate in 2016. And he said he did it, quote, to help Vice President Biden win the election. So how much more explicit could it be that the U.S. intelligence community was involved in actions to change the outcome of the election? And polls show that had the Hunter Biden laptop story been widely circulated, many people would have had doubts about Biden, his vote totals would have been lower, and possibly we would have had a different outcome in the election. So the interference in U.S. elections, which we're told is Russia, is Putin, is the Chinese, the actual agencies interfering in U.S. elections are the U.S. intelligence community, operating through people such as the Clintons, the Obama team, and the Republicans, the Rhino Republicans, who did their best to play up the whole Russiagate story as well. Now, most of the people who have been quoted as talking about Russian interference have backed away from the stories, or have pretty much, some of them still insist on it. I mean, people like Adam Schiff to this day says that that Trump was elected in 2016 by the Russians. But why has there been no accountability? Why did the Pulitzer Prize, the New York Times won in 2018 for its Russiagate story, that was completely, the story was eviscerated by Girth in the Columbia Journalism Review? Why did they not have to give back the award? Why has the truth not been brought out yet on the heavy-handed efforts to blame Putin and to tie Trump to Putin? Well, that's the issue that should be taken up. Now, the reason this is important is that many people who are regulars on this program and our videos and supporters of the LaRouche movement, or just ordinary citizens who know that there's something wrong with this war, wrong with the economic policies, wrong with the overall direction of our country, shrug their shoulders and say, we can't do anything about it. They are too powerful. Well, who's they? The liars in the media who cover for the killers in the intelligence establishment and the military establishment, the Cheneys, the Wolfowitzes, and so on? Well, that's intolerable. But by exposing this and showing that your friends and neighbors and family members are victims of a brainwashing operation may be the beginning of giving them a way out of it. Now, of course, our approach is not just to show who's the bad guy, but to show the solutions. And of course, the solutions are also suppressed. But I wanted to present this idea of a disinformation industrial complex tonight, and I'll turn this over back to Dennis and Mike, because I'm sure Mike has more to add on this subject.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harley, for your presentation. As you just said, we're sure that Mike has been at least as triggered by your presentation as Morell was triggered by Blinken. So, Mike, now that you've been triggered, Mike of UK Column, take it away.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Harley. Right, so we're going to start off with a war, not Ukraine, but Sudan. Now, I don't know how much coverage in the US media the Sudan conflict has had. It's been running for a couple of weeks now. But in the UK, if you want to know about Sudan, you read the mainstream newspapers, you will see that it's all about these two men, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is the military leader of the Sudan military government, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who is otherwise known as Hemeti, and he is the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, which is a sort of paramilitary force. These two militaries are fighting together at the moment, and this is causing all kinds of problems with British and other foreign nationals trying to get out of the country at the moment, but people dying as a result. Now, the reason there is a military government in Sudan is because there were concerns within the military a couple of years ago that there was an effort to subvert the election process for the government, and so they carried out a coup. They took over and have served since then. But since that time, they have been trying to hold elections and get a civilian government back in place. But every time it seems that Burhan attempts to get elections going, there's something comes along to sort of prevent that from happening. And certainly if you look through the Western NGO complex, we find articles like this. This is Sudan's military are calling for elections in 2023. Here's why it's a bad idea. So the West very much sees it as a bad idea for this current government to attempt to hold civilian elections in order to bring a civilian government back into power in Sudan. They claim it's because they're worried that an Islamist government would be put in place. Now, last week, a few days ago, the Russians were active in the United Nations, as they usually are, and they released this statement by the Deputy Permanent Representative to the Security Council on the situation in Ukraine. And I just want to highlight a few of the things that she said. She said, we must state that the current Sudanese crisis was largely caused by an external interference in Sudanese sovereign affairs. This is the key point, an external interference in Sudanese sovereign affairs, but we don't hear about external interference in the mainstream press. Why not? They went on to say the political situation was not a simple one from the start. Security sector reform in the country was amongst the most complicated issues that required elevated attention through negotiation process. At the same time, we saw that many external actors tried to enforce the transfer of authority to civil powers artificially and opposed a number of decisions that were not supported amongst broader population. Reconciliation efforts in the region are underway. Mediator efforts from the African Union, IGAD, as well as neighbouring states. The regionals should be given the space and time that they need. And finally, she said that it's pivotal that the Libyan scenario must not repeat. I remind that with Libya, African efforts were arrogantly kicked aside, and the forceful Western intervention that followed caused a true disaster and destabilized half the continent. So that's what the Russians had to say. And I was interested because, as I say, very, very little serious coverage in the mainstream press of what's going on in Sudan. It is a complex issue, but nonetheless, I was wondering why, what was the issue, and what are these external actors that are operating in Sudan? And so we've got to go to the African media to find out. So here's the Africa report, and this was published on the 25th of April this year. Hemeti's multi-million-dollar image makeover. So remember, this is the man in charge of the Rapid Support Force. This is the paramilitary force which is fighting against the current military government in Sudan. So let's have a look at what it says here. Last November 2022, a small team of French lobbyists met in Dubai with a simple objective: to present a vast Hemeti-oriented communication strategy. For 2 days at the Grand Millennium Hotel, one presentation after another was seen, slides scrolling by, one detailing the progress of the Hope for Sudan operation, along with a variety of media campaigns, political lobbying, and online influence. Enter a new public relations strategy for the Rapid Support Forces. So what we can see then is that the Rapid Support Forces, who are the aggressor, I suppose, in this current conflict in Sudan, are being supported absolutely by the West. And of course, what's happening here in this case is a team of French lobbyists got together to discuss how they could rehabilitate the reputation of Hemeti in the Western media, and the Western media will publish that information without any consideration of whether it's correct or any challenging of it. It gets better. Because here is the Sudan Tribune, and Hemeti and the Troika, and in this case is the Troika is the UK, the United States, and the EU, discuss military standoff in northern Sudan. And so this meeting took place on the 13th of April, just a couple of weeks ago, and 2 days later the fighting started. So Hemeti Mohamed Dagalo met with the UK, the US, and the EU. And within 2 days of that meeting, the war began. So some people may consider that a coincidence. Some people may not. We should also make the point that then, in fact, a few days prior to that, before the conflict began, Hemeti was tweeting out this: the international community must take action now and intervene against the crimes of Sudanese General Burhan, a radical Islamist who's bombing civilians from the air. His army is waging a brutal campaign against innocent people, bombing them with MiGs. Now, people may recognize the narrative that's being built here. It's very, very similar to the kind of narrative that was being built in 2011 in Syria. You might say, or one might say, that the Rapid Support Forces are synonymous with the Syrian armed opposition, calls for effectively a no-fly zone, the rehabilitation or the creation of a public persona for the opposition that is being supported. But again, as I say, no serious coverage of any of this in the Western media. Certainly no criticism of the Rapid Support Forces in particular. Much more focus being spent on how rapidly the UK, United States, and other countries are getting their nationals out of the country. So, just as a by the way, the question is, why is this conflict happening just at the moment? Well, perhaps this gives us a clue. This is from Arab News. Again, no coverage of this in the Western press at all. But the headline here is Sudan military finishes review of Russian Red Sea base deal. So basically what's going on here is the Russians have been in negotiations with the military government in Sudan for quite some time now in order to base Navy vessels in Sudan port itself. And that process is now completed. And in principle, they have approval to do this. But there's a caveat on that. And the caveat is that deal is awaiting the formation of a civilian government. So for that deal to go ahead, for the Russians to be able to base their ships in Sudan port, there needs to be a civilian government in place in Sudan, and there needs to be elections. And I'm going to suggest that perhaps this conflict that's going on in Sudan at the moment is because, or to prevent this type of thing happening. Why do I say that? Well, aside from anything else, the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing out of the usual suspects, like Tobias Ellwood. I've mentioned him several times on this programme before. He is an MP in the UK who serves as a reservist for 77 Brigade, one of the propaganda outlets in the UK, military propaganda. And he was tweeting this out a couple of days ago. It's important to understand the bigger picture. Russia and the Wagner Group have armed both sides in return for exploiting Sudan's gold to pay for the Ukraine war. So everywhere we find Western or external intervention in sovereign affairs, we find the anti-Russia narrative going hand in hand. So, as I say, none of that being covered in the Western press, certainly not in the UK or Europe, and we need to ask why. Now, I've mentioned before that in the UK, the censorship and the narrative control situation is there's an effort by the United Kingdom government to bring legislation in to enforce a censorship regime, and that's known as the Online Safety Bill. It's currently in the House of Lords at the moment, where it gets scrutiny from the House of Lords. They scrutinise every line of the bill, they propose amendments, and they decide, and then once those amendments are proposed, that legislation goes back to the House of Commons for a final round of debate and votes. But I just want to highlight and remind everybody what this is about. First of all, it's about censorship. It's absolutely about censorship. Now, if you remember when I was talking about this before, an earlier version of the bill contained the principle that the government would try to control content on the internet which was legal but was considered by the government to be harmful. And they were not planning on putting in this bill any definition of what legal but harmful meant, or what type of content they considered to be harmful. Because of the pushback on that from campaign groups and privacy groups and so on, the government had to walk back from that position. And so what they're now saying is that where a social media company, Facebook, Twitter, whoever it happens to be, has a set of terms and conditions in place about what is considered acceptable in terms of the type of content that goes on the site, that those companies are obliged under law to enforce those terms and conditions rigorously And if they're not enforced rigorously, they're subject to massive fines and potential imprisonment of directors of the company, of managers of the company. Now, that seems to be the position now in the UK. It's certainly the approach that the EU is taking, and it seems that the United States is taking this approach as well with respect to trying to control the narrative. Here's the next point here, that Ofcom, which is the Office for Communications, it currently regulates the internet, it regulates broadcast media, and it regulates any kind of RF or radio broadcast as well. Sorry. So Ofcom is going to be the chief censor of the internet. We'll come on to the significance of that in a second. There's going to be a ban on end-to-end encryption because, of course, if you want to censor content that's going across social media platforms, and that includes chat applications like Telegram or WhatsApp or Signal and so on, then you've got to be able to surveil what's being posted to those platforms. So the UK government intends to become the first, the UK becomes the first country on the planet to ban end-to-end encryption. And finally, age verification. And of course, that's being sort of hidden under the notion of protecting children, but is bringing in the idea of a digital ID, which means that you can say goodbye to any kind of anonymous posting of anything on the internet in the future. Those are the four main areas that they're aiming for at the moment. Now that bill is still, it's at the House of Lords stage. In a couple of weeks' time, it'll go back to the Commons, and then we'll see what will happen. There are a lot of amendments, and it remains to be seen which of those will be chosen. Now, one of the biggest mouthpieces for government policy and one of the biggest organizations criticizing anybody that's offering criticism of the government narrative is the BBC. And of course, what the main social media company that's getting criticism from the BBC and governments and media, mass media right across the West at the moment is Twitter, because Twitter, since it's been bought by Elon Musk, has completely reversed its censorship policies, its moderation policies. Now, recently, Elon Musk spoke to the BBC. I'm just going to show you a minute or two of the conversation that he had with an utterly pathetic BBC. Well, you'll see how pathetic this journalist is, but let's just have a look at this.
Mike, we don't hear it.
People to police this stuff, particularly around hate speech. In the company. Is that
what hate speech are you talking about? I mean, you use Twitter.
Right.
Do you see a rise in hate speech?
I mean,
but just a personal anecdote, like what do you? I don't.
Personally, for you, I would see I get more of that kind of content, yeah, personally. But I'm not going to talk to the rest of, for the rest of Twitter.
So you see more hate speech personally?
I would say I would see more hateful content in that.
Content you don't like or hateful? What do you mean to describe a hateful thing?
Yeah, I mean, just content that will solicit a reaction, something that may include something that is slightly racist or slightly sexist, those kinds of things.
So you think if something is slightly sexist, it should be banned?
There are many organizations that say that kind of information is on the rise. Now, whether it has on my feed or not. I mean, right, and
literally
if you look at something like the Strategic Dialogue Institute in the UK, they will say that. So
look, people will say all sorts of nonsense. I'm literally asking for a single example, and you can't name one.
Right, and as I already said, I don't use that feed. But
then how would you know?
I don't think this is getting anywhere.
You literally said you experienced more hateful content, and then couldn't name a single example.
Right, and as I said,
that's absurd.
I haven't actually looked at that feed.
Then how would you know there's hateful content?
Because I'm saying that's what I saw a few weeks ago. I can't give you an exact example. Let's move on. Spoken to people very recently who were involved.
Sorry. Right. So apologies for the technical thing there. So I showed you that for two reasons. First of all, because in itself it's entertaining, but also because in that little clip, the BBC reporter mentioned the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and this is one of the key organisations in the UK that is part of this what Harley's calling the disinformation industrial complex. So let's bring them on screen here. Here they are. This is their website. It's all about powering solutions to extremism, hate, and disinformation. And of course, they are absolutely targeting Elon Musk since he acquired Twitter and other movements and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course. But let's just look at what they say about themselves. ISD partners with governments, cities, businesses, and communities working to deliver solutions at all levels of society to empower those that can really impact change. We're headquartered in London with a global footprint that includes teams in Washington, D.C., Berlin, Amman, Nairobi, and Paris. We combine sector-leading expertise in research in global extremist movements with an advanced digital analysis capability. With this, we identify and track online manipulation, disinformation, hate, and extremism in real time. Our digital analysis unit has built proprietary tools delivering social science standards of data. This provides ISD and our partners with granular insights into the evolving actors, tactics, technologies, and audiences involved in proliferating hate, disinformation, and extremism online. We design and deliver programs that empower cities, practitioners, and civil society around the world to mitigate hate, polarization, and disinformation. So you get the point here. Again, 32,000 activists and social influencers around the world. We've pioneered first-of-their-kind intervention models across online spaces, gaming, social media, alt-tech platforms, reaching over 100 million targeted users online to date. Our policy and community networks makes ISD uniquely equipped to scale proven solutions and programs. Now, that's a key point, because while it's absolutely right to look at what the mainstream media is doing and look at and criticize what the mainstream media is doing, because they are effectively in the employ of government. It's not just mainstream media, it's much bigger than that. It's also so-called social media influencers. So we're talking about thousands of YouTube channels, thousands of Twitter channels, people that are commenting on Twitter feeds, employed to reinforce a government narrative and attack anybody that is offering any kind of alternative. They go on to say, we formulate and advocate policy solutions that provide local authorities, central governments, and multilateral institutions with the data, expertise, and technical support to deliver evidence-based policy and programming. ISD has provided policy support and training to over 40 governments in 150 cities worldwide, and so on. So this is one of the key organizations. And just to give an example of the type of thing that they do, UK registered media company. This is a small media company that mainly operates in Arabic, but this particular media company, likely information laundering from Russia. This is for Russia. This is the type of content that they push out, attacks on anybody that is not the BBC or the mainstream press. Now, another example of the disinformation industrial complex here, we'll just mention the Zinc network. Now, this is also about bringing meaningful, measurable change around some of the most complex social issues facing the world today. Disinformation is absolutely part and parcel of this. Well, they look at the clients and partners that they have, the Home Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Department for Education, Department for Health, Ministry of Justice in the UK, got USAID in the United States, Internews Democracy Council, they've got the European Commission, the African Union, the World Health Organization, the Australian government, the New South Wales government, London School of Economics, SACHI, KPMG, Rockefeller Foundation, King's College London. Now, why am I mentioning them? Well, a number of years ago, they were creating a network of NGOs called Expose, the Expose Network. This was the technical proposal which was submitted to the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, I believe in 2019. August 2018. August 2018. And look at who's on here. We've got the Institute for Statecraft behind the Integrity Initiative, the anti-Russian campaign that was run through the British media and British intelligence agencies and so on. Bellingcat, which Harley mentioned earlier, Digital Forensic Research Lab, DFR Labs, one of the big so-called counter-disinformation organizations linked to the Atlantic Council, of course. So this technical proposal was to create a network of NGOs to counter disinformation, as they describe it. They had 3 directors planned for this. Chris Donnelly from the Institute of Statecraft, the man behind the Integrity Initiative, a guy called Amel Khan of Actis and Chatham House, that's the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and Louise Brooke from the Zinc Network. And this was this was aiming to get around £10 million from the Foreign Office in order to build this network of NGOs in order to push against counter narratives to the government narrative. Now, that Exposed Network was never formed at that time because the Integrity Initiative leaks took place, which exposed the entire network, and as a result, they just had to abandon that particular project. But they've set up subsequently other similar projects with the same types of players in them. So I just wanted to highlight that one because that issue hasn't gone away. Now, coming back to the online safety bill for a second, and I just want to briefly look at the end-to-end encryption situation. This organization with Threema, this is an online chat app similar to WhatsApp or Telegram and so on. And they and a bunch of other tech companies wrote an open letter to the British government a couple of weeks ago on the online safety bill and the end-to-end encryption, which they're calling chat control. So this is what they had to say. In addition to the EU's so-called chat control, there's another European draft legislation that used child protection as a pretext for full-scale surveillance of chat communication without probable cause. The UK's online safety bill, together with other messaging services, we take a firm stand against this legislative proposal. We fundamentally reject the online safety bill together with other encrypted messaging services, including Element and Signal. We ask the British government to take the bill's far-reaching ramifications into account and reconsider the controversial draft legislation carefully. Their point is made, but the government has no intention of doing that. Now, another organisation, the Index on Censorship in the UK, asked for a legal opinion from a lawyer on the online safety bill, particularly with respect to the end-to-end encryption issue and the resulting surveillance powers that allows. So they said that a few weeks ago, the provisions of the online safety bill that would enable state-backed surveillance of private communications contain some of the broadest and most powerful surveillance powers ever proposed in any Western democracy. It means the UK would be one of the first democracies to place a de facto ban on end-to-end encryption for private messaging apps. And so the King's Council's legal opinion said that the online safety bill, the notices that come out of that, amount to state-mandated surveillance. That Ofcom, that we mentioned earlier, the new regulator of the internet, will have a wider remit on mass surveillance powers of UK citizens than the UK spy agencies. That it is questionable legally, and that there is a failure to protect journalists because, of course, if journalists can't use end-to-end encryption, their sources are very much at risk. So Threema went on to say this, as currently drafted, the bill would break end-to-end encryption, opening the door to routine, general and indiscriminate surveillance of personal messages of friends, family members, employees, executives, journalists, human rights activists, and even politicians themselves, which would fundamentally undermine everyone's ability to communicate securely. So this is the key point. And I just want to remind everybody quickly of how the UK government is already set up with respect to censorship here. And on the left, we've got, under the National Security Council, the main security services. We now have to add Ofcom to that as well, should this legislation finally go through. And on the right-hand side, some of the key organizations, government organizations that are part of this censorship network. Finally, the final point that Thrima wanted to make was that global providers of end-to-end encrypted products and services cannot weaken the security of their products and services to suit individual governments. There cannot be a British internet or a version of end-to-end encryption that's specific to the UK. And so many of the signatories, or all the signatories to that particular, and we'll just put their names up here, to that particular letter, have already said that they have no intention of continuing to provide their services in the UK should this legislation go through. So I think that's probably, I just want to mention this, I think, because Sajid Javid, formerly Health Secretary, he's not Health, I've labelled him as Health Secretary here, because this is the constant mantra from people talking about the need for this type of legislation. Sorry, he was Health Secretary at one point, so I've used an old graphic here and just updated the quote. But he said last week, in the bill, the government has introduced an amendment that I want to say because some people are campaigning against it, and this is something to do with so-called end-to-end encryption. That's when someone uses, say, WhatsApp. The messaging today is completely, totally, utterly private between the sender and the recipient. This is a playground for pedophiles, and this is the justification that the UK is using. The EU is certainly using that justification as well, and so on. And then finally, before I finish, I just wanted to mention the case of Ernest Morel. This is a French journalist, editor of a magazine in apparently, allegedly, a far left magazine, or a left-leaning magazine anyway, in Paris. He travelled to the UK a couple of weeks ago and promptly got himself arrested. He was picked up by the anti-terrorism police at the train terminal in London that he arrived at. Well, let's have a look at the statement from La Fabrique about what happened. The police officers claimed that Ernest had participated in demonstrations in France as a justification for this act. So in other words, he was picked up under anti-terrorist legislation because he had taken part, allegedly, in demonstrations against Macron over pensions. A quite remarkably inappropriate statement for a British police officer to make, which seems clearly to indicate complicity between the French and British authorities. They also went on to say, perhaps most seriously, during this interrogation, he was asked to name the anti-government authors in the catalogue of the publishing house La Fabrique, for which he works. None of these questions should be relevant to a police officer. Now, he was arrested under what's called Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act. Schedule 7 basically says that a national security port, it's a national security port or border power. It enables an examining officer to stop, search, question, and detain a person traveling through a port, airport, or the border area. This is determined whether that person is or has been involved in the commission, preparation, or instigation of acts of terrorism. So in this case, Ernest was questioned for 6 hours. He was then released on bail. His mobile phone and his laptop were kept by the police, and he has to come back in May to appear in court. The point here is the reason that he was finally arrested was because he refused to give up the PIN number and the password to his devices, and that is illegal under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act in the UK. There is no right to remain silent under that particular, if that particular question is asked, and he can spend, I think, 5 years or so in prison if they so choose. So why am I bringing this up? Well, this is also part of the disinformation industrial complex, the absolute intimidation of anybody that is pushing any kind of counter-government narrative. And although Ernest is the most recent example of this, just a few months ago, when my friend and colleague Vanessa Beeley attempted to come into the UK, she received exactly the same treatment, picked up by anti-terrorism police at the airport, didn't manage to get her connecting flight as a result, and had 6 hours of interrogation by police in London. She also was eventually released, but unfortunately, this is the kind of thing which is going on a regular basis. So that's what I've got for you tonight.
Very much, Mike. That's exactly the sort of thing we expected from you. I think guests will well motivate some of the discussion. There have been many questions that have already come in. And I just want to say that one of the elements of what we'll discuss, certainly as we conclude, is what people can do. I mean, that's one of the elements of one of the areas of questions that people are coming up with. So let me just get us started here. There is, Harley, I'm going to give you this question first. And actually, Mike, this is something you may have something to say about as well. This is from Ronan, and he asks, could you please briefly discuss the dark budget for the intelligence agencies, that is, all the off-the-books or heavily redacted budgets, and their impact? I think the idea of the question is really, besides the defense budgets and other things we're seeing, what are we dealing with in terms of other areas of financing of and deployment of intelligence capabilities?
Well, let me start by saying that what you heard from Mike is a perfect example of how the British have been playing a leading role in shaping this disinformation intelligence complex. That if you have go back to Nina Jankowicz and the attempt to set up a disinformation governance board. Much of this was organized out of the UK. Jankowicz herself was a product of a UK operation, which included the Institute for Statecraft and the Integrity Initiative, and its Ukrainian branch, which included Stop Fake, which was one of the original fact-check agencies, and so on. So this connection between British intelligence, the Ukrainian secret police, and the CIA, FBI, and so on. This is where we find a significant part of what Mike just pointed out. It's not simply censorship, but it's intimidation. It's an attempt to suppress honest and open discussion. Now, on the question, the defense budget this year is around $858 billion, I think. But it's estimated that there's another $60 billion that goes into defense in these so-called black areas, some of which are not so black. They're involved in the nuclear weapons capabilities in the Department of Energy. But there's also the funding for the CIA and the overall CIA programs. And it's not clear how much that is. But one thing that is clear is that a lot of it is off the books because it includes private partnerships. For example, everyone's talking about the Wagner Group in Russia and how this is somehow a sign of a violation of normal military policy. Well, we have gangs of consultants, some of which are funded through the Defense Department, but many of which are off budget, that include government funding, but also then private funding. So I haven't seen anyone who's made a serious estimate of how much money is going into these, but you can be sure that there's also an overlap with agencies such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, now run by Samantha Power, an old crony of the Obama Susan Rice crowd. Power supposedly went into Hungary with a bag full of cash to try and build a civil opposition in Hungary to the current government. This is what Victoria Nuland did when she pulled together a $5 billion fund, which she admitted was $5 billion, which I believe most of it was not on the defense budget. Some of it was through the National Endowment for Democracy. But then this is interchangeable with money from Soros's and other non-governmental organizations for these kinds of running of coups. So it's very difficult to know how much money actually is going into these kinds of black operations and deployment of so-called consultants who in some cases are hit teams and so on. But it's something that should be investigated. Something simple, such as Senator Rand Paul's demand that the money going to Ukraine should be under the purview of an inspector general, was rejected as an amendment by the U.S. Senate, with only 11 senators voting in favor of it. It's $113 billion with no oversight, no accountability. And that's the problem. That's a big part of the problem that we face.
Mike, any comment on this, since obviously the British situation has this element as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, first of all, it's impossible to find out, to what degree covert money is being used. But I would just make the point that, to echo what Harley has said, if we look at the Exposed network that I mentioned as just an example, that was going to be funded by the Foreign Office to the tune of just under £10 million. That's just to just as an umbrella body to organize the NGOs. The NGOs themselves that would be part of that have their own funding streams. They're also being funded in separate funding streams from government departments, but also from other philanthropist organizations, the likes of Open Society and Rockefeller Foundation, these types of organizations. So what we've seen being built since the UK government began its initially invited the tech companies to come into Downing Street to discuss how to deal with so-called disinformation on the various tech platforms. Since that time, there has just been hundreds of millions of pounds spent building up networks of mainstream media organizations, of not-for-profit NGOs, of think tanks, and so on. All, as Harley describes it, this information industrial complex. It's huge, and it's really it's being funded largely openly, but also, if we take the White Helmets in Syria as a key example, they've been receiving tens of millions of pounds, tens of millions of dollars, Canadian dollars, euros. None of it is audited. There's no way. There are no accounts. There's no way to know where that money has actually gone. And I've mentioned on one of the previous appearances here that one of the things that the UK does is that it sends organizations like BBC Media Action, Thomson Reuters Foundation, these types of organizations into countries like Syria or wherever, trains up journalists in the BBC model, and then uses those journalists as the voice on the ground in order to bring narratives back into the domestic media. And they never disclose that they trained and funded those journalists in the first place. So just huge quantities of money going in all different directions. And that's just the money that we can see.
Okay, very good. Now, there's a question, Harley, from Munasha. Now, and the question is, the narrative by the White House that the China peace plan and the 12 points is vague is telling the world what in relation to efforts being put in place. In other words, they're saying that effort is vague, but compared to what? And what actually is in existence other than the Chinese 12-point plan?
Well, the most important point of the 12-point plan is negotiations must take place. There must be recognition of mutual security interests, which has never been accepted regarding Russia or the people in the Donbass. And its main point is negotiations. And especially that there can be funds for rebuilding after the war is settled. I think it has provisions on prisoner exchange and things of that. I don't remember exactly all the points, but the question is getting it started. What the Chinese intended with this was to say there can be a negotiated settlement, and that the Chinese wish to demonstrate in an impartial manner that that's what they want. Now, the government, the U.S. government is saying, besides that it's vague, there are others who are saying that no, this is an attempt to justify Russia's invasion. It's an attempt to legitimize Russian seizure of sovereign territory of Ukraine. There are a lot of things they're saying about it, but none of that's in the plan. The plan is essentially, let's have diplomatic negotiations, and that it outlines the various areas that should be part of the negotiations. Now, the more important issue is, why does the U.S. routinely rule out any prospect for talks? And what they say is what they say in opposition to the Chinese plan, that they don't want to legitimize through a settlement Russian seizure of territory, redrawing of borders, and so on. Now, again, this is so hypocritical. Go back, it's not that long ago, go back 24 years ago to what went on, 25 years ago, what went on in Serbia, where borders were redrawn, where the question of sovereignty was thrown out the window. And what was the argument then? The responsibility to protect. Well, if you really have a sense of responsibility to protect, why was that not used in the case of the people in the Donbass, who were subject to 8 years of shelling by Ukrainian forces, a large number of civilians killed in the attempt to force the people of the Donbass to submit to the Kiev coup? So if you really have a responsibility to protect, why don't you activate it in terms of the Donbass? So, I think what we're dealing with is a bunch of hypocrisy. The real intent of what's coming out of Kirby's mouth and the other spokesman is that the people who decided on this war, namely those who are the leaders of the so-called military-industrial complex, the intent is to continue the war, to do as much damage as possible to Russia. And the security and well-being of the people of Ukraine be damned as far as they're concerned. They're the sacrificial lambs for the sake of the degradation of Russia. And so that's why these comments against the Chinese plan, against Lula, against Macron, this is all hypocritical nonsense and should be seen as such.
The same person has a question directed to you, Mike, or can be directed to you, and it should be thought about, I think, in the context of what you presented on Sudan, and this idea that the move toward any kind of stable civilian government was being interfered with from outside. And the question is, what message is being sent to countries and governments that are trying to transition to democracy when we look at the censorship of information by the democracies like the UK? I mean, clearly that cannot be meant to maintain and promote peace. So what is the message?
Well, whatever the message is, it's not being bought, is it? Because so many countries in South America, Africa, are aligning themselves with Russia and China. They're preferring to go in that direction rather than so the idea of democracy it doesn't seem that appealing to them, because they can see through the charade of what the UK, the US, and the EU are offering. The rules-based international order clearly, it has demonstrated for itself that it makes the rules up as it goes along, and then accuses anybody that breaks the rules that perhaps they didn't even know were there in the first place of being some kind of authoritarian regime or whatever. But I think that the sales pitch for Western democracy is failing spectacularly at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Harley, there's a new person named Patricia, and she's asking, well, what is your proposal? What do you propose is the way to peace in the present circumstance?
Well, first of all, stop shooting. Stop sending weapons into Ukraine. Then secondly, you have to have negotiations, but the negotiations should start with what the proposal that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has made, that there needs to be a new security architecture based on the revival of the principle of the Peace of Westphalia, which is the idea that you have to, in these negotiations, take into the center of the negotiations the legitimate security needs of both parties in the fight. Now, as I mentioned earlier, had that been done at any time between 2014 and February 2022, there wouldn't have been a special military operation. The President Putin had been clear during that whole time that there needed to be some action to protect the people in the Donbass, and secondly, to assure the Russians that there was not an intention to move NATO forces right to the borders of Russia. Now, unless you include that, there's no basis for peace, and that's why Putin tried for 8 years to get a negotiated agreement. They thought they were going somewhere with the Minsk Accord, which would have provided a solution toward the Donbass, which would have included some regional autonomy of federated states. It would have included various guarantees of participation in the government and protection from being attacked. But that was never taken seriously, as we know from the admission by Merkel and Hollande, the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France, who were involved in Minsk, that they never intended to finalize the agreement, but they wanted to buy time to build the Ukrainian army. So as long as the Russians have this image of the West lying to them about NATO expansion, lying about getting an agreement to protect the rights and freedom of the people in the Donbass, you can't have a settlement. Now, what that means is that you have to go in without any preconditions into a discussion. And the discussion should, from the other side, include a guarantee of security for Ukraine as a neutral country, not as a part of a military bloc. So unless those things happen, it's going to be very difficult to have any agreement. And at this point, the Russians don't trust the West for legitimate reasons. And so it's more likely that this war won't stop until there's a decisive end to it on the battlefield. And at this point, it looks as though that would be a disaster for Ukraine. So that's why the Chinese initiative was so important, to say, stop fighting and start talking. And the fact that you have governments, such as the government of Germany, the government of the United Kingdom, the government of the United States, saying that there's no basis for negotiations, means that they're committed to continuing the war. So as long as that exists on the NATO side, there won't be a settlement, because it's highly unlikely that Zelensky would on his own make a break from that. Although it remains to be seen if the Chinese put a more substantive offer for, if Ukraine stopped fighting, that the Chinese would be involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine. So short of those kinds of provisions, this is going to continue, and the blame for that is on the West, which had the intent from the beginning to use Ukraine as a proxy for degrading Russia, as was admitted by Defense Secretary Austin at the first Ramstein meeting.
This question, which is from Marinus, I think takes us into an interesting area as various possible avenues to explore. He asks, what can be done to prevent digital currency and ID? He says, I see this as the mark of the beast. But of course, this is a complex matter, since there are all sorts of digital currency and other matters. So, Mike, why don't you take a stab at this first, and then let's see what Harley has to add.
What can be done to prevent it? Well, aside from Look, if we look at what UK is doing at the moment, every interaction with government now requires you to you can no longer go and speak to somebody face to face. You can no longer pick up the telephone. In many cases, it's got to be done through some kind of web portal. And the UK government is setting up a single source of identity for people in order to, they're calling it one login. Add to that what we've already discussed today over the issue of verification of age on internet platforms, and the issue of the Bank of England and other central banks pushing extremely hard for central bank digital currencies. It's hard to see how that's stoppable at the moment. There doesn't seem to be sufficient understanding. There aren't the big enough campaigns for people to understand the potential risks of it. But so, you know, people can. I know that people are running campaigns to use cash, for example, and only use cash. It remains to be seen how effective those are at the end of the day. I think you know, at the end of the day, this all boils down to how active are individuals getting involved in the issues that they perceive. But and until we get more Jose Vegas out there, I think that's probably what's needed more than anything else, isn't it?
Yeah, Harley.
Well, the thing that people are focused on a lot is the idea of central bank digital currencies, the move to the whole monetary system to a digital system. Now, this leaves out what I think is an intermediary step that's more important, which is that the financial system is about to crash. We see it now with what's happening with First Republic Bank, which was bailed out with $30 billion from a group of banks, and then required, I think, 150-something billion more in different grants or different loans from a couple of federal agencies, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and others. And it's not just First Republic. There's a whole series of medium and small banks in the United States. There are other banks. The Credit Suisse situation is not resolved. Deutsche Bank is not resolved. You've got a cratering of the whole banking system. And the people who are pushing for central bank digital currencies are somehow assuming that moving away from cash, or that they're trying to make you think that moving away from cash is a way to protect the banking system. And it's not. You know, it's a way to have more tight control over credit. So the real issue that we see, going back to the long-time battles that Lyndon LaRouche was waging to get people to understand the difference between a productive physical economy in which you have a credit system to build the productive powers of labor, as opposed to a monetary system which is based on circulation and transfer of money. So the precondition for any discussion of a change in global monetary policy is to deal with the problem of speculation, deal with the problem of central bank control of currency, credit and debt, and also the question of spending, fiscal policy, because part of the Great Reset of Klaus Schwab and King Charles, or Prince Charles, now King Charles, part of their whole idea of the Great Reset is that you take spending policy away from elected representative bodies like a Congress or a Parliament and put it in the hands of technocrats who act on behalf of the private banks. So any system, whether it's a cash system, which the kind of system we have now, which isn't working because of the fraudulent speculative banking policy, or any kind of digital system, if it's controlled by private interests for the purpose of their own gain, it's not going to work. The question is, how do you stop it? I think what Mike said is key. we have to educate people on this question of credit and physical economy, because there are solutions to the economic crisis. The solutions are not bailing out banks. The solutions are not cutting government. The solutions start with LaRouche's 4 laws, having a regulated banking system not controlled by a Federal Reserve, a private central bank that acts on behalf of the largest private financial interests. Secondly, a credit system which ensures there will be credit for the physical economy, for productive workers, industry, agriculture. And then it's focused on upgrading infrastructure and the frontiers of science and technology, because that's where the future wealth will come from. So I think it's a mistake for people to get totally focused on the idea of the digital question, because it's a big morass. There's so much involved in it. The more important thing is, let's address the problem we have right now, which is that we don't have enough credit going into physical production, which means people are going to starve. People are going to be cut off from medical care. We're not going to have infrastructure. We're not going to have protection from floods or from extreme weather. So we've got to start with this question of what is a real economy. And then we can sort out some of these other things. The idea that we have to rush into a digital currency, which you're hearing now from the Biden administration and from some of these globalist bankers, there's no reason to rush into anything. It's not going to solve the problem that they've created. What will solve the problem that they've created is to take the power away from them and put it back into representative institutions that concern themselves with the welfare of the citizens. So, short of any larger dissertation on digital currencies, I would say we have to focus on what we can do. There's a bill now in the U.S. Congress to restore Glass-Steagall legislation. And I think it's 2417, HR 2417. Maybe you know, Dennis. But yeah, HR 2714. People should be bombarding your elected officials with the demand that they pass this bill. This is the first step toward taking the economy out of the hands of the private swindlers and putting it back into the people acting through the Congress. So that's where I would say people should put their efforts.
Okay, Mike, this is from Ahmed. He asked the question, right after China mediated an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Atlanticists needed a new tension site in the area as soon as possible, hence Sudan. What do you think? He's asking whether or not you think that's the reason for what occurred in Sudan. Did it have to do with the fact that peace was breaking out in parts of Southwest Asia? I guess we could add Yemen into that and Syria in a different way as well.
I'm not sure what to say other than yes. I mean, I in the presentation I mentioned the specific Russian deal over Port Sudan and their ability to host their ability to place Russian naval ships there. There's also the European Union sees the entire area from the west, sub-Saharan Africa, from the west coast right across the east coast, commonly known as the Sahel region. The European Union sees that as their area of influence. They call it their southern neighborhood. But there are other actors taking active in that area, not least Tony Blair and his Institute for Global Change. Now, Sudan itself doesn't have any, as far as I know, Western NGOs active and operating there. It's too dangerous. But South Sudan, because if you remember, Sudan was split into two a few years ago, and South Sudan is absolutely teeming with that influence. BBC Media Action's in there. All the usual suspects are in there. So they are there because they are deeply concerned about the influence of China and Russia. And Russia is active in that region. China, the Belt and Road, of course, is doing many brilliant things in the area. And the West, the EU, the UK are very keen to make sure that those countries don't decide to align themselves in a more serious way eastwards. So I think, I mean, I don't know specifically what the reason for or at least the timing of the current conflict is. I suspect that the Russian or the Russian naval interest in Port Sudan is part of it, but just the general situation there with Russia and China active in the region is very much part of that as well.
Okay, he has a follow-up question for you, Harley, and I think for this we'll also put a map up after I ask the question. He asks, what are the chances of China reaching a rapprochement between Algeria and Morocco regarding Western Sahara, considering that if a war breaks between the two, it would be devastating, especially as they are at the doorstep of Europe, a catastrophe scenario equivalent to Syria multiplied by 10. I just want us to put a map up of Africa, particularly Northern Africa, just so people have a sense of what we're talking about. So on the right, if you look on the far right of your screen, you see Saudi Arabia, and you then see Sudan. And you have now, that country's now been broken into Sudan and South Sudan. Egypt, you see there as well. The area that is being discussed in the question is on the west coast of Africa, the northwest coast of Africa, and you see Morocco there, and you see Algeria. And the area that's being discussed is called Western Sahara. You see that to the right of your screen there next on Mauritania. So, Harley, I'll just repeat it again. What are the chances of China reaching an agreement between Algeria and Morocco regarding Western Sahara, considering that if a war breaks out between the two, it would be devastating, etc.?
Can you put the map up again? I want to point out a couple of things. Because this gets to the whole question of how the British look at this, the geopolitics. If you see Sudan, you see that it's in a crucial location on the Red Sea. You look at Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. All of these are countries that have gone through destabilizations recently. In Egypt, it's relatively stable now. The Sudan situation was a powder keg waiting to go. You just had fighting going on in Ethiopia that seems to be resolved. But that area, and then across the Red Sea, you have Saudi Arabia and Yemen. This was one of the choke points with using the Suez Canal that the British were primarily concerned about before World War I. The idea of the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, for example, was a fighting issue for them. The promotion of the Saud tribal forces to become the leaders of Arabia was organized by the British. And then you go across the region and you have the same thing. Now, then you go over to the other side. Start with Tunisia, because there's a battle going on in Tunisia right now. Tunisia was one of the places where the Arab Spring began. And now they're saying there's a new Arab Spring developing there. And what you see, then of course in the middle of it is Libya. Now, some of this has to do with raw materials, some of it has to do with geography, but it has to do with the fact that this is a continent. Africa is a continent which has enormous economic potential. And the potential resides in the ability to have common efforts at economic development, because you have some parts of Africa, like the region we're discussing, needs water. Libya needs water. The Chad, Niger, Nigeria, there's a need for water there. So you need cooperation among nations. Geopolitics depends on using every single potential division to prevent that from happening, whether they're national divisions, whether they're tribal, whether they're religious, whether they're groups within the religions. And so the question about China's role, look what China did with Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, this isn't fully settled yet, but this was one of the most explosive points in the region of West Asia. Would there be a war between the Saudis and Iranians? And in a sense, there was a proxy war with the situation in Syria, where the Saudis were backing the so-called Islamic forces. But you also have, there are a number of other divisions in there. The fact that the Chinese came into the Saudi-Iran situation, and what did they talk about? Cooperating on economic development, which includes rebuilding Iraq, rebuilding Syria. The same thing is true when you go across the north part of Africa. This is an area which has been producing a large number of emigres into Europe, and this has become a political hot potato in Europe, including in the United Kingdom. What if the Europeans worked with the Russians and the Chinese for real economic development, infrastructure, railroads connecting these countries, water projects, power projects? This would be the way out of this, and that's what the Chinese approach is. The European approach is to go in and lecture these countries about democracy, and by democracy, they use various controls through NGOs and others, as we saw in Egypt with the use of the Muslim Brotherhood against the Mubarak regime. So this is an area which can only be stabilized with cooperation on economic projects. And that's what the Chinese are offering. And, the idea that the Chinese are bribing countries, getting them in debt traps, that the Russians are offering military aid against terrorism, and that's why these countries are siding with Russia. No, these are countries that have a long experience with European colonialism. And they're coming to terms with that now by asserting their national sovereignty, but through broader institutions such as the African Union. So there's a tremendous potential in this region stretching from Morocco across to Iran, into Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And that's the area that Halford Mackinder and British geopoliticians were focused on as an area of resources and that should not be allowed to fall into the hands of the Central Europeans or the Eurasians. So we're in a continuation of the 19th century geopolitical battles, but the Chinese have turned over the table. And that, to me, is the hope for that region.
We just keep that map up just for a minute. Let me just add a couple of things just so people have to think about. The nation which is called Sudan, that is Sudan and South Sudan for a moment, was the size of the combination of France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and one or two other countries, just to give a sense of the size of these nations. And there are many problems that come with that. Algeria, which you see there on the map, is 3.5 times the size of Texas. So we're talking about massive land masses, first of all. But then secondly, as has just been talked about, you're also talking about many different forms of warfare, particularly, for example, around the Nile River, which is the real issue, or one of the main issues concerning South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt, as well as Ethiopia. If you look there on the map, you're seeing the Blue Nile that begins in Ethiopia, and you see the White Nile in South Sudan. In particular, these rivers go south to north. So just to first of all just say a couple of things there, not to get too in great detail. Obviously, what China has been doing, and what has been the interesting area, has been somewhat east of there, in terms of Iran and Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and it should also just be stated that Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces, had deployed approximately 30,000 troops into the war in Yemen on behalf of, various forces, the Saudi Arabians and others. So that the complexities that exist here, and the issue concerning not merely the United States, but the British policies in Africa, since there is no independent American policy in Africa which is not thoroughly vetted by the British. It just does not exist. So that when we're looking at these areas and we're looking at these conflicts, that should be kept in mind. And I think what's important is to realize that the fundamental thing that we're trying to do is move the world out of the domain of geopolitics into the domain of a real community of principle, not unipolarity or multipolarity, but a community of principle. I just wanted to point it out because while the map is up there, it's always useful because not you have to keep it up, but it's always useful for Americans to consider this with an actual visual, because most of the time people know very, very little about the area or the nations. Don't know if you want to add anything at this point, Mike, and if not, I think there are one or two questions and then we're going to try to close out.
No, I have nothing else to add at that point.
All right, there's a question we just got, and I'll pose this, Harley, to you. It may be with the second question, but here's what it is. He's from Diotheus, it looks like is the name. If we manage to get a legitimate president that embodies the spirit of the American fathers and people like JFK or LaRouche, then how does that president and the people deal with the aftermath of all the nefarious politicians, agents, workers, inverted actors, celebrities that were working against the common people?
Well, that's a big if. If we could get a good president, had we elected Lyndon LaRouche, we would have been having a lot of fun in the process of rebuilding the country and demonstrating to the world that America is not a basket case. Look, the most important thing is to define as Lynn did, what will be the issues of the next 50 years. And you look at it again, you look at a map like that and you realize there are water projects that have to be carried out, including in the western parts of the United States, major infrastructure. There's so much to do that if you have an American system president, the job would be, the tendency of some people would be, let's put all these bad guys on trial. The ones who've gotten away with no accountability, let's deal with them. Well, you at some point you do have to do that because there does have to be respect for law. But the more important thing is to move the nation into a completely different mindset about the rest of the world, an optimism about the world having 8+ billion people who can do enormous good to prepare for the next generations coming. If you look at what Lincoln did, or if you look at the way John F. Kennedy spoke about these things, you take on the hard tasks and you inspire people to do what's necessary. And I think this is, you often point this out, Dennis, that Lynn wrote, I don't know, maybe about 10 or 12 major works on what should be done, for example, for Thailand and the Kra Canal, a second Panama Canal, the Bering Straits project, the Saudi Arabia in the year 2023. There are many of these projects that Lynn developed that never were carried out, that need to be carried out. And those should be the works that inspire the American people to get off their butts and actually realize that we were given a system that enables us to realize the defense of the general welfare of our population, but to then have that as a basis for improving through mutual benefit and cooperation the rest of the world. So that's what a president should do. And by doing that, you draw a very clear distinction between what we've been doing the last 30 years in particular, but even going back to Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. That's not the America that should be. And so I think by engaging in these development projects, you create a completely different sense in the population of what it means to be an American and to take responsibility, not just for America, but for improving the conditions for all mankind.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Harley. Thank you very much, Mike. Don't think we're going to do more right now because I think that's a good place to conclude. There are various people who are thanking you, Mike, by the way, for the research you've been doing, because one of the things that's been remarked is that this apparatus is finite. It's knowable. It's not just some, quote, generalized deep state. And having a sense of how it operates and the way in which it functions, some of the mechanics, the interstices, is extremely important for people. Gives them a way to think about real people doing real things in real time and what can be done about that. Harley, I don't know if there's anything that you have that you want to say other than what you said in conclusion about any upcoming events or anything that we should be doing to get active. You've referenced, of course, the interventions that Jose Vega did. I'll probably say a little bit more about that in my own conclusion, but I don't know if you have anything at all.
I think Mike said it before that we need more Jose Vegas, and we need people to look at themselves and ask themselves the question, what do I want to, assuming we get through this period without a nuclear war, what do I want to leave as a legacy? And people can make a determination to do something that will have an effect that will radiate throughout history. But you can't do it if you're sitting there depressed or demoralized or cynical. So take the lead from Jose, the inspiration from Jose. Speak truth to people who have power, and you realize that they're not so powerful. They don't have such great minds, and that's why they are apparatchiks for this declining oligarchy.
All right. So in our conclusion, what we're going to do is take one of the questions that was asked here, and I'm going to answer it as a final conclusion, which was, in light of increasing online censorship and channel deplatforming, do our panelists and hosts consider this to be a threat to the Schiller Institute channel and the LaRouche organization? The answer is no. Now, there's a reason. Because we don't really operate from the standpoint of the internet and from deplatforming and platforming and replatforming and retrofitting and many other things, because we don't think that virtual reality is real. Virtual reality is a nonsense term. It happens to apply to something that people do. It happens to apply to something the way that people think, but just think about the term, virtual reality. See, we believe in organizing, not activism. There's another one of those. You can talk about how Paris Hilton is an activist. Well, I don't know what that means. You say that and you say Nelson Mandela is an activist. There's a big difference. And there's an idea called political organizing. It was a proud occupation and vocation for much of human history, although it had different forms at different times. Statecraft is one name for it. But then you have to be careful, because you've heard about this Institute for Statecraft a bit ago, which is clearly a brainwashing agency. So a name by itself does not necessarily describe the intent or content of what people do. Lyndon LaRouche was a person that this organization was created by. He considered himself to be an economist, a physical economist, and he demonstrated that he was that by a series of forecasts that he made starting from the period of the mid-1950s. But his work in economics came from his successful solving of, for himself, a set of philosophical problems involving exactly what people today talk about around artificial intelligence. What LaRouche did in his mid-20s, particularly in the 1947 to 1952, was to devote his time to determining in what way human creativity is unique and singular in the universe and in its application to the world. That the laws of nature that are knowable to human beings are only knowable through discovery and through invention, and by the creation of critical experiments by means of which an idea is willfully applied to some transformation in nature, and that transformation happens as that idea forecasts that it will occur. So that whether that is the invention of the telescope, or the invention of, or the use of fire, for example, in the case of early mankind. The point is that a physical principle is not a thing. A physical principle is spiritual in the sense that it is a creative act which has no weight and has no color, has no shape, but nonetheless is able to have profound effect in the material universe in various ways. Certainly what mankind has been doing in space travel, the fact that we have the Voyager aircraft, which is now some 15 billion miles away from the Earth and is still traveling now in extrasolar space and still transmitting back signals, indicates something about the power of the principle of scientific discovery shaping the way in which our encounter with the physical world is changed. Our sensory apparatus does not tell us what the world really is. The world outside of us is not the way we see, hear, or smell, or anything like that. It's only a very, very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. And therefore, things that are invisible to us or not experiential for us in the normal tactile sense are knowable because of our ability to understand principle. Now, that is what distinguishes the LaRouche organization from every other political force on the planet, other than those that have also gone through the same rigor of trying to carve for themselves an actual philosophical outlook. So people who've studied Bernard Riemann or have studied other of the great precursors to Einstein and have tried to figure out in what way those ideas should impact not only education in general, but political practice in particular. Those people are the people that are the architects of the future that mankind is going to be experiencing. And therefore, although it is true that LaRouche was harassed and he was put in jail, I think we have a picture of LaRouche with Ronald Reagan, for example, where he had a discussion with Reagan during his 1980 run for the presidency. Both of them were candidates, and they met in New Hampshire. And to the best of my knowledge, I believe that was the only time that they actually met and had an extended discussion. But there was a great sort of correspondence between them around particularly the question of what has come to be known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was a design that LaRouche pioneered, though it was not original entirely with LaRouche, in which laser weapons, laser defense weapons, would be jointly deployed by the Soviet Union and by the United States based on new physical principles that were at that point in advanced stages of investigation, especially in the Soviet Union. And the American scientist Edward Teller as well was very aware of this. And so what happened was that he proposed that instead of all of the arms control treaties and all the other kinds of geopolitical and geostrategic maneuvering that was going on to try to prevent thermonuclear war, why not supersede the entire apparatus, the entire system of negotiations by new physical principles, by superseding nuclear weapons themselves? What if we make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete? And the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, adopted that policy on March 23rd, 1983. Although it is true that after that policy was adopted and it was not implemented, and Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp LaRouche were nearly killed, murdered in a raid October 6, 1986, as you can see, we are still here 37 years later. So the reason we are not afraid is because we have a conception and a mission, which mission is an immortal mission. That's not unique with us. That's also true and been true of other people in the past. That was true of Martin Luther King, and it was true in different ways, clearly Franklin Roosevelt and others who've had that conception of mission. So that the idea is that if you're committed to that, you always win because you never stop fighting. You never give yourself the right to give up because there's something else you're doing, and you're doing it in a way which your enemy is incapable of comprehending, because in order to do that, they have to transform who they are. They believe that man is a beast, and they believe that the will to power is the greatest power in the universe, rather than the notion that human beings are unique and that they have a relationship because of a divine spark to the universe as a whole, which they express in ideas, discoveries, inventions, and in the communication of those to other members of the human species. And that the wealth, what makes wealth for the human species, is the individual human mind. It is not a commodity. It is not gold or silver or anything like that. The unit of measurement of wealth is the creativity of the sovereign individual human mind. That is not idealism. That is the only workable scientific conception of progress that humanity can come by. That is unfailing in its application and in its perfectibility. That's what we represent. So we're not afraid. And we say to all of you who are out there, if you don't want to be afraid, then you simply have to do what we did. You don't have to do it the way we did it necessarily, but you have to do what we did. It's the content. All over the world, whether you are in Africa or in India or in Asia, South America, people have different cultures. They have different ways of expressing things. They have different ways of seeing things, because languages and language cultures mean that some ideas are not even available to many of us, because you can say some things in one language you can't say in another. And in fact, that means you can think about things in a different way. That's why all of us are necessary to one another, because in this way, with a decreasing degree of imperfection, we can actually pool our creative resources and change the universe. And that's our immortality. Our immortality is not with us as mortal beings. Even if we could extend our lifespan by 1,000 years or 10,000 years, it would eventually come to an end. Our immortality is in this zone, this realm of creativity. Now, this is something that just escapes the foggy bottom of the State Department. It doesn't escape people in China, and it doesn't escape people in Russia, and it doesn't escape people really in many other nations of the world, in India, or the more advanced cultural expressions that you have in South Africa or Nigeria. There are many other people that get this. But the world has yet to see a movement, a political movement that starts from that premise and then makes that premise the dominant form of organization of human society. That's not an ideology. It can't be an ideology by definition. It will fall apart if it's an ideology. It has to be a method of practice. And the key about that method of practice is telling the truth, knowing the truth and telling the truth. That's the method that Helga Sepp-LaRouche talks about of learned ignorance, of Nicholas of Cusa, or of the committee of the idea of the coincidence of opposites. It's the method she has written out in one way, in one expression, in her 10 principles for a new strategic and development architecture. So this is the basis for a new society and a new culture and a new form of politics, including politics in the United States. So we invite you all to join in and find out about that. And the first step is to be willing to get up and tell the truth in the condition of adversity, to liars, so that others who wish that to be done, to want to get involved in that fight, see somebody fighting. And then people will join that fight. And so we leave you today with what we played earlier, but some of you may not have seen, which was the intervention done at Columbia University earlier this week against the cover-up artists, the sophists, the destroyers of truth, the denizens and the caretakers of the cave of darkness from which we're trying to extricate humanity.
Oh, is this the lecture hall with Seymour Hersh? I'm looking for the one with Seymour Hersh because it's a policy and press hall event. So shouldn't we be talking about the Nord Stream since that's the biggest story of the century? And you guys, I'm sorry. I mean, you have the executive editor of the New York Times there who came out with a phony story to try and block Seymour Hersh. It's just kind of funny how that happened, I mean, did you even acknowledge Seymour Hersh? All of you are executive editors of papers that broke Pentagon, My Lai, Watergate. Is this the same papers or not? I mean, is there anything you've gotten right in the last 20 years, or am I mistaken about that? I mean, it's just kind of funny because Iraq, wrong. Syria, wrong. Russiagate, really wrong. Okay, I mean, the list goes on and on. So the last thing you could do to try and actually fix your reputation is acknowledge that through leaks, we had to find out that Zelensky was going to bomb Moscow on the anniversary. I mean, if you're so impartial, shouldn't you at least say, right, that Zelensky was going to bring us on the verge of World War III? That seems pretty fair. While Julian Assange rots in prison, all of you've got, fat checks because he's in jail for doing your job. And you know what? Tucker Carlson ain't no Seymour Hersh, but he did something you guys are scared to do. Speak the truth and actually be critical of the war, which is why he was actually fired from Fox, because you are all cowards. Every single one of you. None of you have actually had any relevancy. And you know what? The mainstream press is now dying. Nobody's ever going to listen to you again. You have no credibility with the public. The only people who care about what you have to say are elite assholes who have nothing productive to say anymore. And it's dying off. So will you at least say something, either about Nord Stream or Ukraine or the fact that Zelensky brought us to the verge of World War III and the only reason we knew about that was through leaks? Go ahead. It's a free speech event, right? You guys are the press. Let's say something here. Mr. Khan, come on. You're the executive editor of the New York Times, I'm just trying to get into some good trouble here, man. Woo. Listen, Karen, get out of my face for a second. I got to talk to these gentlemen. Okay. Well, I just want to hear what they have to say. Go ahead. I'm done.
Wait your turn. Wait your turn.
You know what I'm telling you. Come.
Wait your turn.
You could project if we can't.
I would just say I think it's important to hear everybody's point of view.
Yeah.
So thank you.
All right.
I do think that we need to give our moderator a chance to ask other questions.
We're on the verge of World War III.
Some of the people in the audience also do so. Thank you. Really, thank you.
Say something about this bombing. We blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Listen, don't stand there while there are people rotting in prison. Nobody said anything about Uhuru, right? The socialists who are in jail for being critical of this war. God damn it.
Let's go.
At least say something about the people in jail for being critical of this war. They don't deserve to be in prison right now.